to my left, Melanie Coyoy Godinez. She's a member of the Sol regional team, so it's the advisory team for Credible in Guatemala. She's coming from Guatemala. She's a journalist, a radio host, and works on topics related to displacement. I should mention that Melanie has been working as a newscaster for 5 years, and she talks about resilience and the impact of manipulated information. Nick Everett is also here. He's going to be the moderator of this session. He studied political sciences. He's specialized in Latin America and the Caribbean. He has been working with me in IREX for 4 years in the topic of independent media in the region. Then we have Yanela Tapoyimam. She's the fact-checking director of Ojo Público. She studied in Lima, Peru, and she's co-author of a book called We're Not Alone, AI Tools in the Era of Misinformation, that was published by Ojo Público in 2024. Janela is going to talk about the activities Ojo Público does when it comes to manipulated information and fact-checking. We are also joined by Maite Neira Aramboli, who is also part of the regional advisory team for Credible. She comes from Peru. She studied political sciences at the Universidad Mayor de San Marcos, and she's a co-founder of a grassroots organization that works promoting culture between young people. And we're also joined by Alison Axton. She represents the University of Southern California. She works for communications and climate issues at the university. And she's in charge of the priorities and initiatives to improve understanding about climate change related issues. So I would like to tell you a little more about this study we conducted to talk about that, and then Alison can tell us more about how to improve reporting on these topics. Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. Could you please share the clicker with me? Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start telling you a little bit more about the study we conducted with the support of all of my colleagues here in the University of Southern California. So as Laura said, the goal was asking some questions about the understanding or the perception of young people about the climate crisis in the Latin American region, but also how those young people interact with the ecosystem on these issues. So we conducted this survey. We share that through our network of young people we work with in the 4 countries where we have initiatives. And we received 147 responses from people from Guatemala, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, and Peru throughout 3 weeks. The survey was conducted using a Microsoft Teams. And of course, this survey doesn't intend to be representative of all the points of view of young people. These are the points of view of the young people that are part of our network and responded their survey. So this is some context about the respondents. Half of them almost come from Colombia, but we also have a significant presence from the Dominican Republic, followed by Peru. It was pretty balanced between genders, but we also had 60% of responses from people that are 25 years or younger. So I'm going to give the floor to Maite to tell us a little about the perceptions of young people on the climate crisis. Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. Why is this important? Why is it important to talk about the perceptions of young people? Because these help us better focus our communications, actions, but also learning more about where we are and how to promote the work young people are doing and identify the issues they are committed with. So first, we're going to talk about this insight that's important because young people are worried about climate at a global scale. This has to do with the advance of social media. So young people, regardless of their nationality or country, are able to learn about what's going on in other countries, whether they're neighboring countries or not. So that helps us raise awareness, but it also means that we need to keep working on building our networks or our social media profiles to continue to articulate the positioning of these topics within the public international agenda. We think this is key because it allows us to have a global focus, but also a more community-based approach, which is one of the pillars of our action. This concern young people show about the environment, we wanted to know a little more. Talking about climate change, there are various topics, but what are those topics that worry you the most? The idea was to know where to focus our efforts. So one of the main topics was the danger or the threat of the resource scarcity, the damage to the natural ecosystem, but also other topics like economy and social justice. So this helps us better understand that young people are aware of environmental topics and that they have a cutting impact, that there is an impact in various areas. So considering the economy does not mean that we can think of climate issues from the gender perspective or the youth perspective, the impact on children, because they are the future, the generations to come. And from that, we jumped to talk about the factors that prevent action. This is key because in an event like this, when we're talking about communication as a mean for activism, for change, some of the things young people mentioned was that they didn't have enough time to get informed about what's going on in their communities, that they were too busy. And another finding that's important, they said they didn't have reliable sources and that they lacked resources. So this means we need to continue strengthening our efforts to share content that goes in line with the worries of young people. And we also saw that disinformation and fake news that are spread have an impact on that. I mean, it's not seen as a danger or a threat yet, although we've seen there's an impact already. So this means we need to keep working on that for young people to be able to recognize that as a threat. When they learn about the news, when getting informed, they need to be aware of these vulnerabilities when sharing information. And with this in mind, we also are able to identify what hinders at the global level, at the national level, producing a change in environmental topics. And here, one of the key findings is that there's a lack of education or a lack of conscience or awareness on environmental matters. We also talked about the relevance or the role of the state or government because of the opinion of young people of their governments. So their opportunity to act is reduced because they do not trust. We know that the relationships are mediated by the media to a relevant extent. So we see that there's a limit to what the media can do when there's not enough trust from young people. So there are some factors that we identify that prevent action. So we need to move to a more community-based approach because it has to do with the people with which we interact every day and the impact we can have in the community, in the territories, considering different phenomena. For example, let me tell you about the Peruvian case. A few weeks ago, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued an opinion of the impact on a community because of the extractive activities that were being conducted that ended up with the disappearance of small businesses, but also there was a negative impact on culture and tradition. That's why we need to talk about community, about how the damage to the environment is not just economic, it's not just related to the territory, it also has an impact on the quality of lives of people. So there's an opportunity there to connect with young people, to link young people with their communities, and for them to get politically involved, for them to engage. So that's why we feel hope and optimism, because more than 60% is worried about this. So that means there's a chance to communicate ideas, to position specific agenda. So the stories we tell through the media, whether it's digital or traditional media or investigative reporting, can resonate and transform into activities that can help the future to be the best for future generations. And with that, we continue to the next topic, which has to do with the interaction with the information system. And for that, I give the floor to my colleague, Melanie. Thank you so much, Maite. I work for a news organization called Plaza Pública in Guatemala, and many of the topics Maite was mentioning are the same in Guatemala. We are a diverse region, Latin America, but our problems are similar. And on the first slide here, you can see how young people feel that they are well informed in these topics. They think they know enough. They think this is a relevant topic for them. So maybe that's because the younger generation grew under this constant alarm. They've been hearing that the environment needs our help, that they need to be aware of how the length of their showers, etc. So there is that awareness. They know about that. But when talking about the topic in more detail, we see that this is a topic they discuss. It's something interesting for them. It's part of their daily conversations. Because, yes, they are worried about climate change because that's the reality they grew up in. But here we see some of the more relevant findings related to news organizations and how representative they are. They think that news organizations are neutral in terms of representation, but they feel more represented in digital media or social media, not in the traditional media, which at the end of the day are the ones that are more exposed to in our countries. So it's important to take that into consideration as well. Young people should feel represented. In the case of Guatemala, for example, most of our population is younger than 30 years of age. So why don't we feel represented in our news organizations in a topic of which we know of? It's a topic we are aware of. So why aren't the media covering our needs? If that's the case, right? So here you can see what are the sources young people use to learn about the environment. Here you read the names of social media, right? Those are the main words. So that's not wrong, but we all know that social media are breeding ground for fake news, misinformation, half-truths, outdated pictures. So they end up confusing people on this complex topic. And I think this is something we've been talking about with our teams at the Sol. We think this is our opportunity to promote young people to create their own content, to talk about their own reality and what's going on with the environment. So use social media and commit to produce quality information within this media, which are their sources of information. I'm saying this because of what I said before. There is a lot of misinformation on social media. But what are they looking for in terms of information? They want information focused on the truth. That's something very important for young people, or for content to be trustworthy. That's something important for them as well. And how can we make content more trustworthy? So young people believe that you can trust the content if their families, if their friends also trust that news organization, that source, that Instagram account. And something the study also covers is that young people want to see more humanity in the way these topics are covered. I was just thinking about, based on the words of another presenter, Frederick Mukira from Africa, he was saying, we always talk about the environment from a general point of view, but people are part of these stories. There are families behind ancestral knowledge that's not taken into consideration. And those are the people that receive the first impacts of climate change. So we need to put people at the center. That's important for young people as well, but also having some visual supports. Something else that we can see here, this tells us about what young people think about this topic. Maybe it's something that's not covered by the media enough, because journalists and or the owners of newspapers don't think this topic is relevant. And most newsrooms actually say, okay, let's talk about the environment, but this is actually a cross-cutting topic because it has to do with justice as well in our countries. As Maite was saying, in Guatemala, we also have cases where indigenous people face or are impacted by these extraction industries, and this is something we need to mention as well.
The youth feel calm regarding the way they interact with the information. They believe that they are able to interpret whether the information is trustworthy or not. And I think that is necessary because it is part of the resilience, understanding that out there is a ferocious internet and has a lot of information, but they are or feel capable of navigating those immense waters. And they also believe that there's distrust because there is a lack of information about the environment. There is lack of information focused on the people or that talk about those stories, and that creates a lack of those conversations that are needed. And this is wonderful because, in a way, it shows us that they are making actions to make a change or taking actions to make a change in signing petitions on the internet and it's not just complaining or part of our conversations, but they are actually taking actions and making decisions about those issues. And to conclude, the perspective of the youth, they say that it should be included in environmental topics. They should be included. And from our perspective, we need to stop thinking that the youth are only in social media. They also need to be present in our news and news pieces. The idea is to find allies, and we can find them in the youth. And I think that that is one of the most important doors that we can find and that we were able to find in our study. Thank you, Melanie and Maite. It was a wonderful representation of our team. Thank you so much for the data presented. Now that we have the perspective of the youth, we are going to give the floor to another person that is quite young, but from another perspective, from the media outlets. Uh, Janela will tell us about her experience in Ojo Público. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our session. From Ojo Público, which is means of communication, of investigation, digital investigation in Peru. And what I will share with you comes from these findings mentioned by Maite and Melanie that I thought were very interesting. And these points to visualizing two things. First, to show who is responsible of the issues of the environment, and also sharing the stories that Melanie mentioned, giving a face or a voice to the people who are affected by climate change. And the perspective that we use has to do with the reality we are in Peru, which is very complex. And investigating the power behind it has to do with investigating cases related to organized crime and how it affects people in mining areas in Andean zones and in the Amazonas. They are suffering issues and problems with deforestation and air quality. To do so, I wanted to explain what is happening. Why did I mention organized crime in these cases related to climate change? Currently, the cases of illegal mining are expanding increasingly, and they are using dragas to extract gold in the Amazonas of dredges, and not just there, but also in that triple border with Colombia and Brazil. The confluence and the lack of control, as well as the absence of the state in the area, has allowed these criminal activities to take place and are increasing. And so we started to investigate how these dynamics of illegal activities came up, of illegal mining of gold, and this is even reaching levels where with criminal organizations like Vermelho Command are finding allies in local actors in those communities to amplify and reinforce, sophisticate, and diversify their own crime. Because they are working in collaboration with communities, providing or giving money to them and doing work for the community, which is something very complex and very delicate to address, but it exposes the lack or the absence of the state. And the same thing happens with traffic of illicit traffic of fauna or wood, and we've seen this in different reports in Peru or international or transnational reports where we are exposing that there isn't an enough traceability of the exports of timber or exports of different types of animals. And this allows for exploitations, for the destruction of ecosystems, and for this damage in the Amazonas in Peru, which has a very complex geography, but the state hasn't been able to respond to this problem. We have a scarcity of controls, and it hasn't been addressed at the institutional level in our country, although it's very diverse and has a lot of natural cultural richness. There is an absence of the state, and that has allowed organized crime to expand and have repercussions in indigenous communities in the Andes as well as in the Amazonas. And we actually published a report related to the climate, showing what is happening in Puno, which is an Andean area of the highlands of the Andes in South America, in the Titicaca Lake, where ironically the provinces nearby, near the lake, which are the Azángaro province and Acora province, many communities are migrating to the cities because of drought and the lack of harvesting due to this. Their main source of water are rainfall is rainfall, and so there has not been as official research focus on the amount of people migrating because of this problem, but we have gathered several stories where we can evidence the amount of people that are living these areas. In the past, there were hundreds of people inhabiting these areas. Now we can see only the elderly living in these provinces because of drought. I know that I am talking about many problems, but it's important to show them, just like it's happening in Guatemala, and like Melanie mentioned, in our territory, there are hostile acts against environmental defenders. Uh, Park ranger was killed in Maracaeri and in Madre de Dios. It happened a couple of days ago. They assaulted the vice president of one of the most important indigenous communities. Last year, they murdered Quintu Inuma, which is also an environmental defender of Quichua community in San Martin, which which denounced the illegal extraction of timber. It has a lot of risk. It is a very riskful activity to be an environmental advocate. This happens in the Amazonas, in Cayali, in Selva Central, Junín, and Loreto, where the biggest amount of, the most amount of indigenous communities inhabit, and there are a lot of deaths around the complaints of these types of illegal activities. And from Ojo Público, in the area that I'm leading, which is fact checking specifically, we have detected some cases of misinformation that talk about climate change and also indigenous peoples. And a couple of months ago, there was a very broad strategy from the Congress. They started to propose a bill to modify the law that, in a way, acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are in isolation of initial contact, so that this acknowledgement isn't only from the Ministry of Culture, which takes place or can be performed by a supreme decree, but by municipal ordinance. And the sectorial committee can recognize them scientifically and in a technical manner all of these communities, and these indigenous communities were excluded, so they wouldn't be a part of it, and that was also denounced. And so behind that, there are several political parties or sectors, and with organized crime or with these illegal activities, this doesn't happen in an isolated manner. There are certain initiatives from the Congress that provide flexibility to these controls, and we find issues such as this. And we found that the regional government in several occasions has shared this information and saying that there are no indigenous peoples that are living in those conditions, and there are no scientific way to prove it. And this is what we have been reporting through fact-checking and also through several other reports. This is a news piece where we share how these strategies or parliament initiatives work to fulfill these goals. These are some fake news that have been shared in my country. It is quite complex. This was with a meteorological phenomenon that caused a lot of rain and flooding in the northern coast of the country, and there were a lot of videos and photos. These were times of uncertainty, but thanks to the tools that we had, we covered this topic to mitigate this misinformation. Now, I would like to tell you what we have been doing with Ojo Público to deal with this misinformation, with manipulated information or deceitful. And what we want to do is to expand the use and the practice of fact-checking in different spaces. As an example, we have several initiatives of fact-checking workshops and teaching in public institutions. We have provided some workshops in public schools, like Fe y Alegría, to teachers who teach technical workshops. They are not journalists. These are people who are training other uh, youngsters regarding technical studies, but it doesn't have to do with the profession specifically, but it helps create awareness about the media in those spaces. We have the Latin American network of fact checking. We are training teachers of different universities, about 50 teachers in different areas of Latin America. And we also had an initiative related to, or with, including the youth through Credible, and we gather this concept of houses, which is joining young people, content creators in just one house. And in social media, they were known because they did videos, fun videos on TikTok, and we selected 10 young people from the capital of Lima and also from the Amazonas in the region of San Martin, and we made them part of these dynamics, or they were part of different games, trivias, and we created awareness in terms of these topics. So these games require them to verify photos, videos, or certain statements after going through a training session, of course, provided by Ojo Público. And something that we were looking for was that through these playful spaces for these young people to become aware about the risk, about the manipulation of the information that is shared in social media. We did another contest, and we did charades about conspiracy theories, and we let imagination flow from our production team. But we had a strategy plan related to fact checking. And lastly, I also wanted to mention about an initiative, and I know I don't have much time, but this is related to fact checking of languages to respond to this scarcity, not only in the youth, but also of indigenous people that don't have information in their own language. In our country, there are 48 native languages, specifically in the Amazonas, and what we wanted to do was for our fact-checking to be made through interpreters in 36 native languages of the Amazonas and the Andes. And with their help, we did this, and we disseminated the information about what we were doing. This was done during the pandemic, and we spread information about the pandemic, specifically in these indigenous communities. And to conclude, we have a very similar initiative, and I will share this and we'll conclude with this slide. We have an initiative that was made by a body that gave more weight to this work of the fact-checking of languages. We use AI to create verification content. This is a tool that is used in small drafts in regional radios. And what this tool does, it gives more time to the communicator that don't necessarily have a lot of human resources or time to verify. And this tool helps automizing these texts in native languages. It is an innovative tool, an initiative, the first one in Peru. And what we want to do with it is to give value again to the native languages in our country, and so that this is a good tool for regional radios to promote their own stories and local coverage of topics of public interest. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Janela. And now, oh, I don't know what happened. Anyways, we will start our panel. We don't have much time, so I think we will answer a question probably. I have a question for all of you. I'm going to start with Maite, because this is the question I prepared for you, basically. So throughout these 2 days of discussions, the conversation has focused on the environment and our possibility of action as humans. As data suggests, young people are worried about this, but they also show some optimism, and they have a lot of knowledge about what's going on and what it means for their future. So I wanted to know, where do you think that optimism comes from? and how these organizations represented in this fora, but also in news organizations like Ojo Público and others, can support the action that comes from that optimism. So, Maite, you can start. Thank you. I think this optimism has to do with the rise of new media. Talking about gender or climate change was improbable a few years ago, or talking about indigenous communities and learning about what's going on with them on a weekly basis, which is something we do at Ojo Público, for example. I think the willingness to talk about the climate crisis from various points of view is one of the main motivations, because it tells us that our work is not limited to do some small actions, as I heard this morning. Sometimes it has to do with a political change. And so some young people are protesting, for example, in Peru for the signing of the Escazú Agreement, something that was covered throughout these days too. And also there are examples of resilience from journalists and environmental advocates. So I think that's the most important thing that we can learn from this: resilience, best practices, but also keep building community, a global community, using the networks to thrive and become more resilient to this crisis from a place of hope and joy. Thank you. Would any of you also would like to comment about that? How to make use of that optimism? How to leverage that optimism? Well, from Ojo Público, we try to leverage the optimism by creating these spaces like this with games for alphabetization, training about the media. In the past few years, we've seen the impact of our work. Institutions like Fe y Alegría, for example, is also doing some work with the Ministry of Education in our country to include fact-checking as one of the topics of the school curriculum. And the workshops we offered were related to the environmental impact in different districts where these public schools are located. So I think that those small wins or accomplishments that go beyond teaching also help us make use of those spaces to get closer, to reach out to young people. And that's something you can replicate at the university, for example. Because we've seen that when we talk about climate change, health, or politics with young people, there is misinformation. And so they need mechanisms or methods to fight that. So they need these fact-checking workshops to have the tools they need to fight misinformation. Thank you. I think this is also related to what we mentioned earlier. Make use of that optimism, that willingness they have, so young people from their own reality, their own context, can do something. Because sometimes the media talk about these topics in general terms. And again, as I said, as part of climate change, the everyday challenges, we need to talk about people, their stories. So I think it has to do with that same challenge. Yes, I just wanted to add something. I think this is something we need to continue to explore that was shown by the data of the study. I think we need to keep digging on that as part of the communications or information ecosystem. You see the age of the respondents and their gender they identified with. This gives us some information about those who consider to identify as males tend to say that they are well informed compared to those who identify as women. So I think there's something to study there as well, to ask these questions in some of the more impacted communities or the ones that are underserved or marginalized, and see how this data apply to that reality. So I think we need to keep digging to see how much of that optimism can also be seen in specific groups of young people. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. We hope to do more with the data we gathered, but we expect this study to be the first of many studies or research focused on how we can better analyze the interaction of young people with their media ecosystem. So thank you so much for all of your comments. And thank you for giving us the time and respect the times we have. So now we're going to go to the second part of today's session. And we are also going to switch languages. I'm going to start speaking English now.
Bring to the front or bring to the voice Allison, who will lead us through about a 30-minute workshop on best practices around communicating on climate change and climate issues. So, Allison.
Well, thank you, Nick. I want to thank you and Laura for your incredible organizing work, and it's a true honor to sit next to these accomplished panelists. I want to start by talking about what you mentioned about men, and will somebody repeat that statistic to me?
So I don't remember the statistics, but what I do remember is that there is a difference in the respondents, right? Like how much you know about this topic. People that, identify as with a male answer that they know more. That, you know what I mean? Like
That's what I thought.
So
you want to know another statistic?
Yeah.
A survey has revealed that nearly half of all men believe they could safely land an airplane.
Exactly, yeah.
So I say this because confidence is an extraordinary issue when it comes to communicating about climate change. During the day at the university, I work on a lot of training programs. I train journalists who aren't covering climate, how to integrate climate into their coverage, and I also train scientists or other specialists how they can begin communicating about their research. The most interesting overlap I find in those journalists and let's call them those scientists in the before and after surveys I administered all of them is that the scientists say, oh no, I can't communicate about climate because I was trained to communicate about this very, very specific part of science. And what journalists say is, I certainly cannot communicate about climate because I don't have a scientific background. And by the time they're done, things usually change. I did a training program with 8 ABC's big American network, with 8 ABC outlets throughout the country. And 6 months after we completed our training, they doubled their amount of climate coverage. And, we didn't necessarily, we talked to them a little bit about climate science, but what we really did is we increased their confidence. So that is my number one goal for this small group that's here, is that by the time we're done, you will feel very, very confident that not only can you do this yourself, but like that this is simple enough that you can work with children to do it also, and that you will know what resonates with youth. So to begin, and I'd like to start by saying that everything that I'm going to tell you here is the summation of an ongoing, essentially 4-year literature review on climate communication best practices. These aren't like Allison's cute ideas of what works. This is what works based on a lot of people spending a lot of time researching. So, for example, when I say keep it local, so one of my pet interests is the Arctic. It is the sleeper diplomatic region of the world. I think it's where the US and Russia are closest together. Critical minerals are being unveiled every day as the permafrost thaws. But it's probably not appropriate for me to get into my Arctic spiel while I'm here in Santiago. Nor is it really useful when I am in Los Angeles. When I am in Los Angeles, I need to talk to residents there about wildfire. We have a serious issue with wildfire. We have big issues with air pollution. We have enormous issues with drought. So when I say keep it local, if you're trying to express to a youth audience, any audience, what's going on with climate change, talk to them about what is happening to them. That personal resonance really means a lot in storytelling. This is a big one. For decades, we have talked about what is coming for us with climate change. We've talked about, 1.5 degrees, which is also so abstract. I won't even get into my frustration with that kind of language. But we've talked about, do it for your grandchildren, that sort of thing. Well, guess what? Climate change is happening here and now. It's happening today, and we must start communicating about it as a phenomenon of this moment. The best time to do it is during an extreme weather event that we can attribute in some way to climate change. And by the way, there's tons of attribution tools out there at my website at USC, just like Google USC Climate Center, or there's a QR code at the end. You'll find some attribution resources. So if there is a flood today, this is a really good, and you can attribute it to climate change, then today is a really good time to talk about the effects of flooding. We also know when it comes to passing policy, something like after 2 years, after a major event, like let's say a major hurricane, people forget about it. You cannot pass the legislation years after the thing happens. We got to do it now. Talk about the thing that's happening now. Talk about climate change today as if it's happening now, because it is. When we are telling stories about climate change, we have historically told those stories with white people and white men front and center. And I'm sorry to say that this still happens, and that it's worth noting, especially if you are talking to kids who are going to see examples in the stories you tell. Show other kids. Also, represent women of color. Man, if there's one thing that really gets me shaking my fist, it's when I read a story about something that's, say, happening in New Mexico, and they call the white guy scientist in Colorado. That pisses me off, and we shouldn't do that anymore. Call the expert in your community that you're working in, and may I also encourage you, if you really want to be radical in your thinking, to reconsider the notion of expertise. Who gets to be an expert? Do you have to have a PhD in geology to be an expert? Do you have to be an atmospheric scientist? What if you have lived there your whole life? What if your family has noticed these changes for generations? That's expertise, and that's really worth listening to. Okay. I have heard a lot in the last 2 days about the problems. I've heard so much of what one of my graduate school professor referred to as admiring the problem. We are talking a lot about the issues of disinformation. We're talking a lot about the grim media landscape and the violence. And I am in no way saying that we should stop doing that. But I want us to complete that sentence. Like, say more. So if, if we have an extreme problem with, production of renewable energy, your story, whether you're a journalist or a person talking to a school kid, should address what we can do about that. We should be talking about solutions. And I'm not talking about painting a perfect picture that there's, this one thing out there or even a couple of things that are going to solve all of our problems. You should interrogate those solutions. Like, if somebody says to you, we're in a bad situation, but nuclear is going to solve the problem, like, interrogate that a little bit. It's probably, look, I don't know how we're going to get out of this entirely, except it's probably going to take a multitude of solutions, but so many of those solutions exist right now, and we are deploying them as we speak. So we've really got to talk about that. Okay, this one is especially for the UNESCO crew, okay? Y'all love an acronym in this room. I don't know you, but I know you. You love to talk about the IPCC. I do too. All of this other stuff. We have so many of these acronyms, and it is really easy to slip and to use these in our everyday conversation, in our writing, without spelling them out. I'm here to remind you that we have to spell these things out, especially when you're working with youth. Do not expect anybody to know what UNESCO is, and it is not enough even to spell these things out. So for example, and I want to say that I breach all of my rules all the time, and I'm not perfect. I mostly get it right. I better, otherwise I wouldn't have a job. But I am not a perfect climate communicator all the time. But this winter in the Northern Hemisphere, I was talking to my parents and I said, oh, I'm getting ready to go to this COP conference coming up. And my mom approached me a few hours later and she said, I'm really surprised to hear you're working with the police now. And I forgot, my dad's an elementary school teacher and my mom owns a small business and they don't know what COP is. We know what COP is, but something we have to stop doing is imagining that everybody else knows what these things are. And even when we spell out COP, what is a conference of parties? Is that even what it's, I even forget what it stands for. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's not enough to just spell it out. We have to explain what these things are and why they mean something. And I bring this up because I know you know this. You all learned in school that you spell it out at the first reference. But I'm asking you just think about it even in conversation, how we can improve upon our language use. Okay, know your audience. So I grew up in a very rural area, and I live now in Los Angeles. When I go home, the people in my community, grew up in a community of 25 people, that's about 15 minutes outside of a community of about 500 people. And I'm pretty sure none of them believe that climate change is real. And so how I talk about climate change when I go home is very different than how I'm speaking with you about climate change, just different than how I speak with my own children about climate change. And I think this is one of the hardest things because everybody, when I give these kinds of talks, says to me, geez, just tell me 3 things to do. Just tell me 3 things to do and I'll do them. If you'll just tell me those things, I can do them. But part of the difficulty is having that kind of social awareness, pivoting as needed sometimes, so that you can address the person who's right in front of you. So here I will talk IPCC all day long. When I'm at home, I'll say to my neighbor, how was deer season this year? And my neighbor might say, oh, it's interesting. There are so many more deer by the lake this year. Oh, I'll say, that is interesting. What about the year before? Oh, and the year before that? So it seems like there's a trend. That's interesting. There's a trend. The deer seem to be moving near the lake. So how's your kids? I don't bring up climate change with them. I have some colleagues that will say in very explicit terms, say climate change no matter what. And I totally respect that. I respect that we're all going to have different ways of communicating about it. But my goal is to move the needle. And I know when I'm speaking with my community at home that if I'm talking about the IPCC report and the data, they just don't care. That's not going to work. So unfortunately, you have to calibrate a little bit. Okay, so I started my career in broadcast journalism. And I spent a lot of my career working as a visual arts curator. And believe it or not, those 2 things are what led me here. About 5 years ago, I became obsessed with the idea that we were misrepresenting climate change visually. I became obsessed with the polar bear and iceberg images and couldn't take it any longer and had to do something about it. So now here I am. What I want to say is that pictures matter. Pictures really, really matter. I love some of the images that you all showed up here today. They were really evocative. And when it comes to images, it's, it goes along the same lines of some of the other things I was talking about earlier. If I'm here talking to you about climate change, why on earth would I show you a polar bear on an iceberg? That means nothing to you. Also, there's plenty of research now that says that we need to humanize this. Somebody here, many of you here were talking about how this needs to be a humanized issue. You want to know one way you can humanize it? Show a photo with people in it. Put people in your images. Do not just make this something that only affects the forest where there's the river that's overflowing. Show people. There's a great resource called climatevisuals.org, I think. And the images are free to use for most news organizations. They have a database. They're almost like a stock photo agency for climate change, and they use maybe like 7 different criteria for evaluating images, and all their images are incredible, and there's tons of images of the global south in that database that you can use that will illustrate climate change in a way that is really effective. How am I doing on time? This is my speed reader version. I always like to end my conversations about how to communicate about climate change by saying that I know this all feels like a lot, but don't worry about getting it all right. As I said, I don't get it all right all the time. One of the most important and effective ways to combat climate change, so says the research, is to talk about it, to socialize the idea of climate change, to just normalize it. I personally think that the stories that I enjoy reading in the news the most about climate change, who enjoys reading a story about climate change? I mean, sometimes they're kind of bleak, but they relate to things that I really care about, like baseball or my family. There's a narrative quality to these stories. And that's what we need, is a little bit more of that from all of us. Just talking to our friends and family about things that relate to us in our lives. I also like to remind people, in my country, the issue of climate is so extraordinarily politicized that I have been in some conversations with people recently saying, like, do we need to rebrand climate? One of my colleagues actually did some research on this and found that climate change and global warming are still the phrases that are resonating most with the public. I don't know if I want to say resonating. They're maybe like the most legible to the public. Like some of these other things, I've had other colleagues that have tried to propose new language and it just hasn't stuck. But if I was in the United States, I would say that you don't have to be a Democrat to vote for climate. And I'll say here that it doesn't matter what your political leaning is. It's, I think for most of us who are working in this space, we're pretty devastated that climate has become a polarizing and political issue. I also hope that on some level today, you got enough information from me and you got this sense that you don't have to do it, like, if you don't do it all right, then you shouldn't do it. No, like, if you drive a gas car, you can still talk about climate change. Like, if you are talking to your friends about the UNESCO conference and didn't explain what it is, you can still talk about climate change. My point is to just talk about climate change. And if you want one more thing to do, and you live someplace where you can do this, vote for climate change. Vote for climate initiatives. At my university, I'm working with students on a climate voter guide that will come out this fall, and I bet wherever you are, you might be able to find something similar. Do I have a last slide, or is that it? Oh yeah, there it is. There's a QR code to the website of my center at USC to quickly give you a sense of some of the things that we do and how I might be able to help you or your organization. Like I said, we offer training for all different kinds of organizations who are working on climate communication, but I also have a resources page there with media-trained folks from all different fields who you can call as experts. I have some free resources for climate attribution. I have an encyclopedia of words that if you don't fully have the lingo down, you can use. Lots of things there. And guess what? It's 6:48, Nick.
I'm very excited about that, Allison, and also very excited about your presentation. Thank you so much. I actually have good news for everyone, which is that I have a final question for everyone on the panel to answer. So I'm going to say it in Spanish first, and then I'll say it in English for Allison. Bueno, me gustaría darles una oportunidad.
I would like to give you an opportunity to conclude the conversation because it is the last session of these days. Considering everything that we learned, that we heard, and that we saw during these days, what is a message that you want to leave for the youth that wants to be leader or change the conversation around climate topics towards a focus towards actions and not just talking about a topic? So I would like to give the floor to Laura to answer, and I will say this in English. That is a really good question, Nick. You will be the moderator of all of our events in the future. Not so long ago, I bought a book that's it's called How to Prepare for Climate Change. It is a very American book because it has a lot of tips or advice how to make your house prepare or like things like that, right? And I think that the most important thing is do it in your own way and make it your own. There is a lot of manipulated information, actors that want to manipulate this information with political goals behind it or economic goals behind it. There's a lot of noise around it, and I think that, like Alison said, we can all see that in our community it's necessary to take a walk and listen to people's comments and to realize and make your own way, your own path in the way that you understand this problem. And I think that the most important message that I will share with the youth that are working in this topic and how this is related to manipulated information. Let's not be overwhelmed. Let's follow our instinct. Let's be inquisitive, and this will lead us to those actions for us to communicate and make our communities participate. So don't lose the trust and nor the faith. We will be able to find that thing that resonates with you, and you will be able to work on that.
Would anyone else like to answer the question? So briefly, I would add something to what Laura said. I would like to use the space to talk about what I've been discussing with other communicators and young indigenous people that are directly impacted by this problem. I think something interesting is that they see this issue as a social reivindication, how to showcase these problems. They use visual arts or cinematographic projects, different types of arts, and of course from the point of view of research as well, through radio shows or TV shows, because they are faced with this context that has risks. So I think I would take that momentum, that drive, as a social vindication to talk about the issues that impact them, using art as a media for that. Thank you so much. I think it is also important to talk about this, about how all types of knowledge are valuable, not just the academic knowledge or scientific knowledge, is the knowledge of young people, of indigenous peoples. We can also learn from that. And I also believe, when talking about misinformation and all, in the newsroom we always talk about how to fight misinformation. It's not just about information, it's also about training. So offering training is also important to make use of that enthusiasm. I would like to add something to what was said. I think we need to talk about youths in plural, because we are talking about different gender identities, different capabilities, different origins or walks of life. So if we want change, we need to allow all of them to talk from their own reality, because unfortunately what we see in our communities, it's different than the capital cities. it's different. It's different when you are in rural areas. So I think throughout the conversation we have highlighted that we need to make it local and remember how important it is to have all those spaces for young people and different people to talk about these topics. I'm thinking about the cycle of life, right? These panels where they talk about the engagement of children in environmental topics, because that's important too, or the participation of women in rural spaces. Yesterday, the words of a woman were really moved me. So we need to talk in plural from the social point of view and from the community.
I think it's, for me, very important that young people know that we are in this with them. Too often our young people are told, oh, I'm sorry we did this and it's on you now. No, I stand by you, and I am sure my colleagues do here, and we can do this if we're in it together.
What an optimistic and positive note to end this on. Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Bueno, todas.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our panel members and all of you for attending this session. So let's give a round of applause to all of us. And thank you to UNESCO for this opportunity. Thank you very much.